very encouraged. And so, Ellie, the first thing I would say is this is an even more ambitious plan than what we had heard from the government back in the fall through the fall economic statement. And I'd highlight two key areas of where this is actually beyond what we thought had been committed. Number one is the timing. And so the government in the budget announcement signaled that they will actually start moving legislation to create open banking in Canada this spring. It'll be a two-part process, one piece of legislation this spring, one piece of legislation later this fall through two different budget implementation acts. The second bit, and the bit that I am most encouraged by, is the scope of accounts that are going to be in the first phase of open banking. And really, it's open finance based on what the government has announced. So in addition to what we've seen in the US, which is checking accounts, savings accounts, credit card accounts, in Canada, all manner of credit accounts are going to be included as well. Mortgage, auto, you name it. And importantly, investment accounts are going to be included as well. And so this goes beyond just banking products. This is financial products. It's the notion that whether you're a consumer who's using a bank account or you're trying to build your wealth through investments, you'll have the same rights and same protections when you're trying to access and share access with this data in Canada, irrespective of where those accounts are being held. So very encouraged, Ellie. Of course, now we actually have to do the hard bit, which is get the legislation enacted into law and start moving this forward. But after 6+ years now, we've got a very detailed, concrete plan. We've got the political will by all of the parties in Canada to move this forward. And we've got the timeline under which this is all going to proceed. So very encouraging indeed. A number of reasons. I think the grand vision of open finance, at least in my mind, has always been interoperable systems globally, right? Such that if you're a consumer who's living in Europe and you decide to move to Canada, you don't have to start from square one all over again, right? You don't have to start with no credit score and no ability to access credit. You don't have to find a new bank and establish a history with that bank. You don't have to worry about how you're going to finance a car because there's no credit history for you to base that financing on. That's obviously a grand vision, and that's going to take a while to get to. But in the North American context, there is so much interaction between Canadian and US firms. Many of Canada's large banks are also active in the US and vice versa. And Canadian and US fintechs, in many cases, work on both sides of the border. And given that the two markets are at very similar junctions in their journeys for open banking, it's entirely sensible for both markets to try to move lockstep with one another in order to allow for interoperability. There's all sorts of benefits. For fintechs, the idea would be that the third-party requirements in the US for effectively accreditation are very similar or the same as what the third-party requirements for accreditation are in Canada. And so there's no additional compliance lift or significant compliance lift in order to be accredited in Canada. For the consumer, you have a much wider range of tools to choose from when you're trying to manage your financial well-being, whether that tool is accredited in the US or in Canada. And then from a technology perspective, of course, it makes a ton of sense. Why should there be two completely different technology rails upon which open banking is delivered in both the US and Canada, when culturally, socially, in so many different ways, there's so much interconnectivity between Canada and the US? And so it's a completely sensible way to proceed. And I was certainly very happy to see it called out so specifically and so overtly in the budget. At so many expos, the subject of conversation has been whether. Will Canada do this, right? And when will Canada do this? And what will it look like? And will we ever get the political will? And I think now it's a very different conversation. The conversation now is how. What are the details? Like technically, how are we going to implement this? And so interoperability is a great concept and one that I think everybody philosophically is aligned to. But the details of how you do it make a really big difference. How do you align, for example, third-party accreditation in Canada with the US? How do you align regulatory expectations? by, in Canada now, the FCAC, which is going to be the governing entity of open banking, and the CFPB in the US. How do you align the technological requirements for data providers in terms of minimum quantitative requirements for their APIs, in terms of authentication, in terms of compliance, uptime? And then how do you align the consumer experience? Do you need, for example, uniform consent flows for consumers in both Canada and the US so that regardless of what side of the border you're on, the consumer journey is very similar, if not exactly the same? What are the uh, limitations on data usage for third parties under that accreditation criteria? Because in the US, there's a pretty significant proposal. So I'm expecting a really good deep dive into the how we do this as opposed to the whether we do this.